Hey, welcome back to the SeerNova Comics Podcast. This is episode 90, Remastering a Comic and Lessons Learned. And in this episode, we're going to discuss the 5 rules to remastering your comic. And stay tuned to the end for one extra rule.
Hey,
Boom.
Episode 90. We're back after so many pre-recorded episodes of this podcast. I'm never doing that again. We'll never say never.
Yeah, don't say never.
But it was so many episodes that were from our virtual Comic-Con that was last year, and that's going to be...
This year we decided to do it again.
Except it's going to change it a little bit, but we'll talk about that later. We're going to be talking about the 5 rules of remastering your comic.
Yeah, some of these rules too will apply to making comics in general, but definitely when you're remastering a comic, these are extremely important to keep in mind.
Yeah, so let's get into that. So rule numero 1 is edit your script.
Yes.
Our first version of Seer Chronicles, the script was more of a storyboard. It wasn't really a script. So what we're going to be talking about mostly is just like our first artist that we had do it. He was kind of working off a storyboard, less of like a formulated script of like what it is now. So yeah,
definitely when you're working on your first comic ever, first off, if you're deciding to remaster a comic, it's likely because it's an older comic. It's something you worked on in the beginning, maybe when you still didn't have your feet wet. So your comic storyline might not have been as optimized as it could be. In previous episodes, I've talked about, the fallacies of the live action Aladdin, so I won't go too deep into this, but essentially there's key things that you want to have in every panel to make sure the story is moving forward. And when you first get into comic book writing and editing, you're not going to know how to do that to the best of your ability. So if you're going to be remastering your comic, you want to make sure that storyboard is on, or that story is on point. You want to make sure that you're actually telling the story you wanted to tell, and you're not just redrawing an old story, because a redrawn version, although it's going to look, better, a clearer story will also be much better.
Yeah. People actually say that the cover kind of like hooks people for a comic, but like they stay for the story. So the first issue usually is they just pretty art, but like if you get people to like back your Kickstarter or Indiegogo, whatever, or just a store wants your comic, it's because fans like the story once it gets like issue 2 and on. So
yeah, the cover is kind of like you can trick someone into buying it, but if you want them to tell their friends to buy it, they need to like the story.
Yeah.
And so even if you redraw the whole thing and it looks beautiful, and then you pay some dude $500 to make some fancy cover art, you're going to still be limited by the story, because word of mouth is still the best form of marketing. And a really good story is a really great way to get your fans to retell and share your story.
Yeah. Rule number 2: don't be too easy on your artist. This is totally because of this is me. This is all me. So our first artist, Ricardo. Yeah, I'm gonna drop names. So Ricardo was our first artist, and
we've worked with enough Ricardos that's actually confusing. So it's perfect.
Yeah, that's true. So, but he, I was being too easy on him because like this was kind of our first like go for making a comic, and like we said before, it was more of a storyboard. But at the time, I thought the script was fine, so you shouldn't just be complacent with that. But so you shouldn't be too easy on your artist, because one, they can kind of control what you're doing, and then you don't get the full story. Like our story, yes, it was a storyboard. Basically, it wasn't more of a script, like edited. But he didn't even add some pages in that were actually in that, so it didn't translate well when it actually went into like an actual comic and that's one of the main reasons why we are remastered it basically, because some things that were important were not like added at all, and then people are like, well, there should be like a page or two here and it's just like missing. And I was like, yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah, and honestly, that's if you're working with an artist who doesn't know your story inside or out, or isn't like a really top tier artist, and even then, they could be one of the best artists in the world, but if they don't know your story, they might not be able to match the style or mood of what you're trying to portray. So when you're working with your artist, you want to make sure that if you see something that doesn't make you comfortable with your story, like let them know ahead of time. Don't just go, oh, like, yeah, it's okay, and then 3 pages later you realize, actually, now that looks different there, it looks weird here, right? Like you like be picky. Like you're paying them, hopefully a decent rate at least, as long as you're paying them well. You can be a little picky, and even if you're not paying them well, honestly, many artists are trying to get their foot in the door. They want to showcase really good artwork. And if you're not a satisfied customer, you're not going to tell people to go to them, right? So even if you're paying your artist a much lower wage, they're going to be, wanting to have you as some like a champion for them, going, hey, like, you should definitely check out this artist. He's incredible. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure you're not too easy on them, so that you're satisfied so much with the work that you do want to share that. Yeah.
Rule number 3, constant and clear communication. So we have been learning, we've always been learning, but our first artist didn't send all of the pages at not at once, but he sent like a few pages and didn't like kind of give us any progress report on anything. So we have changed since then, obviously have adapted to all of that. And we're like, oh, so some people do it that way. So what we do is we do pencils, and we don't do the pencils. The artist does the pencils. I can't draw. They do the pencils, and then we look them over. So either they do the roughs, which some artists have done, like Adam Fields has done roughs. We look at the roughs. We then comment on things, mostly Dylan, and he either tears it apart in a very nice way, and then and then he's like, oh, well, this is actually supposed to be here or something, and then he moves on from there into pencil.
Yeah, and the point too is, like, you can have different plans, which we'll talk about in the next rule, but basically the whole idea is making sure that you're consistent with it, right? Like, whatever you're doing, no matter how your progress is, like there could be someone who goes right to inks immediately, but whatever it is, you want to make sure that you're looking at it constantly. Like, you don't want weeks to go by and you're like, hey, what's going on? They're like, oh yeah, I already drew 7 pages and had 3 of them colored. It's like, whoa, I haven't even seen the first page. Like, what happened? So constant and clear communication is extremely important. You want to make sure that your your vision for your comic is being seen. And if you're not constantly communicating with your artist, you'll also find very often that if they have other work, yours might slip to the side. You want to make sure that you're constantly like, hey, is this going well? And you don't want to be a thorn in their side. You want to be annoying, because then they might not want to work with you again in the future. But you certainly don't want several days to go by if they're drawing on a daily basis, or more than 1 week go by if they're drawing on a weekly basis, and not have communicated with them. And don't wait for them to reach out to you. This is your project, right? You're paying them for it. You're the one that has to manage that.
Yeah. Our current artist that's remastering our comic, I didn't talk to him for like a couple days, but then I reached out to him and I'm like, oh, how's it going? And he's like, oh yeah. And I'm like, I'm just busy with a Kickstarter that we're running right now. So that's why I haven't checked up on him as much as I usually do. I don't like hound him, but yeah, you should definitely like have clear communication, because if you don't, then you wind up having to either remaster your comic, or you just choose to grow from that.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is the reason why we're mentioning these rules now is that if you're remastering a comic, it's likely because it wasn't exactly how you envisioned it before. So aside from the constant communication, it's being very, very clear. Like, don't say, no designer is going to, or every designer knows this, whether you're a graphic designer, a brand designer, or you're a comic book artist. If someone comes to you and goes, oh, could you make it look a little cleaner? Like, what does that mean? Right. And you might not, that's why if you're a comic book creator, I would highly recommend learning a lot of the comic book lingo. Like read some quick little blurbs and articles on it, find some books on it. You want to know how you can communicate with your artist clearly in the words that they understand, because if they have to translate everything that you're saying into words they understand beforehand, and I don't mean like a different language, which very often you might deal with that with certain artists if you're working with them in different countries. But if you're working with any artist, whether they're your native tongue or not, you want to make sure you're using the words they understand. So don't say, oh, I wish it was bigger. Like, be specific. Like, what part was bigger, right? Like when we're describing scenes to our artists now, we're like, we want this in the foreground, this in the background, this in the middle ground. We want the left, center, right, top, middle, bottom, or top, center, bottom, right. We want to make sure that we know exactly what we mean when we talk, and we want to make sure that they understand what we're saying when we talk.
Yeah. Do that. Rule 4. Set your budget, set rules.
Yes.
So, budget, if you didn't know, creating a comic is a lot of money. It can range from, I don't know, a very cheap comic. I don't even know what the cheap.
I would say it depends on how many roles you take, but understand in comic book creation, it goes writing, editing, penciling or roughs, ink, coloring, lettering, right? That's a lot of steps.
And then you edit probably around like 1 or 2 more times too. But
I'm talking about the story edits. I'm talking about the original, like an editor, right?
Yeah.
The rest of it is like, looking at it consistently.
But yeah, usually it's like that. If you're the artist, then obviously you do a bulk of the work. And if you're the artist and writer, like the creator in general, and do everything, then you do everything. But you still got to follow like the rules. You're not going to cover a page and be like, oh, I didn't ink it. Like, what? Doesn't make sense.
Well, not just that. You want to set the rules for your budget. If you're paying an artist a certain amount of money to get a certain amount of stuff done, make sure that they stick to that plan. You want to make sure that, let's say your artist says we'll get 5 pages a week or 2 pages a week, even 1 page a week, whatever it is, set those rules ahead of time so that you know that you're spending your money on, like, you know what you're getting and what you're spending your money on. And the artist knows what they're supposed to deliver, because you don't want to, pay an artist and then have them disappear for a week and be like, oh yeah, I was working on another project. Like, no, you want to make sure they know, like, oh, I'm paying you now for this project for the end of the week, because an artist has no idea. Right? They don't know when you need it unless you tell them. They don't know how quickly you need it unless you tell them. They don't know what your rhythm of getting these in, right? Like, let's say you plan on editing comics every Sunday, right? Then you need more pages every Sunday. So you need at least that work done by Sunday, right? If you're doing it on a daily basis, right? If like this is your sole purpose of creating comics, well, then again, you need to make sure those artists are pumping those out on a daily basis. And so making sure that there's rules for what you're spending your money on. Don't pay an artist to do something, have them send it to you, and then when it's unclear, like, actually, can you make these changes? They're like, oh, that's going to be extra. Well, then make sure you know that ahead of time, right? Because if you're paying for a penciler, you're paying them a decent rate, and you're looking for minor changes, and they're asking you to pay for a whole new page, probably not a good artist to work with, right? You want to make sure that you know what their rules are and what your rules are for what you're paying for. And if you need to, like, look into all of the things that can go wrong, and then essentially figure out, okay, how does this artist handle those, right? What happens if they need to redraw the entire page? What happens if they need to redraw an entire panel? What happens if they need to redraw an entire character within a panel? Or what happens if they need to redraw the environment within that panel? All of those things are going to be different per artist. Some of them, they'll just be like, yep, I'll do as many revisions as you want. Some of them will be like, okay, like I'll do 2 major revisions or 1 major revision, right? Or they'll be like, hey, I'll do 1 major revision and, unlimited minor revisions like facial expressions, right? If it's like, oh, can you just make his eyes a little angrier, right? They're not going to be So you'd be nitpicky about that, but you want to make sure you know that ahead of time, because you don't want to bring on an artist for a major project, have 4 pages drawn, and suddenly you're like, oh, I didn't know that we were going to have to repay to completely redo this page, even though I just want this one panel fixed, right? So you want to make sure you know what their rules are and what your rules are, and make sure that your budget can handle it.
Yeah. Should also, we haven't done like contracts really yet, but we're going to be moving into that because of our whole year of dealing with things. So deadlines, we're going to start formulating like deadlines for projects, because we have certain things that need to get done at certain times. So we're going to actually start doing contracts. We had signed a contract with one of the artists for 2 of our series, but from now on, I think we're going to be doing that, because it's just.
And that's part of the setting rules, is like, you don't need to have a 40-page contract for artists, right? Honestly, in most, at least in the States, right? Most states, word of mouth, right? Which means like the written word or text, right? Just like an email. Like if there's an email stating that, your artist will deliver every week for this amount of money, and these are the general rules, right? Then that's pretty much fine. Like you also don't want to scare off your artist with a 300-page contract, making sure that they can't leave their house unless they've drawn your artwork, right? But you want to make sure that they do at least have some rules set. And the other reason for that, it's not like you're going to go out and sue your artist. The whole idea is that if they're not meeting those standards, like word of mouth is super powerful both ways, positive and negative. You want to make sure that your artists are keeping to their word. And, if you find out they're not listening to anything you're saying, they're charging more than, they, should for what they're doing. They're not following their own budgetary rules, and they're breaking the ones you've set. Then you need to make sure that like you're noting that, like, because if you're in this community, you want to make sure that you're working with good people, and you find out your friend is making a comic and they're like, oh yeah, I was thinking about working with this artist. It's like, whoa, like we had a clear contract and this person was not following them, right? So it's definitely very helpful, because there are some people that they'll charge an arm and a leg. We talked to someone on a previous podcast, so like, I'm the best in the area. It's like, have you ever done massive work before? It's like, no, all indie work, right? So some artists get a little big for their britches, and yes, some artists are incredible, but make sure that you are in fact keeping them to the rules they set. Even if it's as simple as setting an email in the beginning, save it into Google Docs or into Word doc or whatever, and just make sure you know the rules and make sure that you're following through with them as well.
Rule number 5.
Yes, which definitely leads over to this.
Have a clear project management plan. Like we said before, there's pencils. Oh, there's writing, editing, pencils or roughs, pencils, inks, colors, lettered pages, and then most of the time the letterer would do a great job, depending on who your letterer is or whatever.
And actually, I'll say one other thing too. If you are not the writer, if you're just a creator, so like this is for the people that they're just creatives, they just have a good idea in their head and they don't even write the story. We met some people like this. We even offer this on our platform to beginning to end, including the writing. If you're just the creator in the beginning, before the writing, you also might have concept art, right? So that would be one other thing along your project, is that you have concept art that could include character concept art, equipment and vehicles, environment, things like that to keep in mind. So yeah, if you're not the writer and you're not writing out your whole story and don't already have a picture of this in your head, you're definitely going to want concept art. And even if you are a writer, you still might want concept art, so that you and your artist can both go, oh, okay, this is what this character looks like. In fact, for some of our artistry, or for some of our comics, we have characters, front facing and side facing, and then like a unique like action pose, so that we know that our artist can see this is what this character looks like in panels.
Yeah. So you might have to edit the lettering after the lettering is done, because sometimes either you miss something in the script, even though you have edited it once or twice, which we actually had to do for our comic scales.
Let's start from the beginning before we get into lettering, right?
Yeah.
So when you start with the writing of the story, whether you're the writer or you hire a writer, after it's been written, you're going to want an editor. Like for us, Greg is the writer, I am the editor. You want them to be two different people, even if you're on the same team. The idea is you can't edit something you've written, right? Because you've seen it. You've seen it 100 times. You're not going to notice it. That's why, someone else who walks into, or actually, I just thought of something funny. Those old Lysol commercials when someone walks into the room and you're nose blind, right? You remember that? They're like, you walk in the room, it's like, oh, it smells like dirty socks. It's like, what are you talking about? I don't smell anything. It's like, because you're nose blind, because you've been there. So that's the same with your writing. You're not going to see what it is that could be wrong with it. And so that's why you want an external editor. And especially if you're much more of the idea person, right? So you're writing out your story, but maybe you're not like a storyteller in the sense that you don't know how to, if you were over a campfire, you couldn't pull people in, then maybe you want an editor just to make sure that the story is actually being written in a way. You see, look at the dog gets it. You want your story to be told in a way that actually pulls readers in. So that's the first step of after writing. And now that you've gotten a story that's well written and you're handing off to the pencilers, and as we mentioned before, they might do roughs or they might go right into pencils. But either way, you want to make sure that after that first step, you get a clearance point, right? So that's what we do at least. And again, it depends on who you're working with. But we have our artists with a pencil draw out what the scene will look like. And very often we're like, oh, okay, I see what you were doing here. This is what we meant, right? Way before that's like all the way colored and lettered and they have to, redraw the whole panel. We're like, oh, this scene doesn't make any sense. So like a small example, we had a panel where one of our characters looked shocked or like angry. I don't remember which one it was, but they were one or the other. And they were angry. That's what it was. They looked angry in this scene and they were supposed to be shocked. Like it was a scene where like they were getting shocked, right? Not like electrical shock, but like they were like, whoa, what's happening here? And so because of that, like we saw that in the pencils way before it's all the way colored, right? Because if this was colored, then basically we have to have the entire face redrawn, re-inked, and recolored, which, it's either that or they have to redo the whole panel. So that's something to keep in mind, is to actually look at each of the panels very clearly. Have a checklist, like say, okay, here's the character, right? Because we've had this before where like we're watching this character throughout all the panels. We had a comic book printed, and by this point it's already done. And someone goes, "Who's this guy?" Like, what are you talking about? He's the scientist, right? It's like, oh, where's his tie? And we're like, whoa, tie's missing in this one panel where it's kind of important, right? Because he's so far away, you can't see the details anymore of his face, and because of that, you don't know who he is. So it's very important to like follow each character through, right? So if you've got four characters in 3 pages, right? Look through that character each time and make sure they're the same. Then look at the environment and make sure the environment is the same. Make sure whatever it is that's important is the same. And then go through and make sure the story makes sense, right? Is this person shouting? Like, do they look angry? Right? So you got to have like a little checklist, whether it's in your head or it's on paper. I definitely recommend having a checklist on paper for characters, making sure you follow them along, because that's happened to, so many times with artists that we've worked with, and even the good artists that we work with, it's just every once in a while they're drawing panel after panel, just like when you're the writer and you get lost in your own story and you don't see this blaring issue that an editor will. An artist can do the same thing. They're 12 pages into your comic and suddenly they're like, oh, I forgot to draw that little badge she's supposed to have on him, or I forgot to put the hat on him, or like, oh no, I drew his hair slightly different. So when the colorist got to it, he thought it was a different character and he drew it a different color, right? So very important to understand that, when you're going along the penciling. After that, the inking. So the inking is definitely going to be where you're going to see very clean details that are drawn in there. And, Greg has seen these where like, you look at the pencils, you're like, that looks great. And then you see the inks and you're like, oh, like now I see what you're doing with that. Or sometimes we're looking at the pencils and we're like, and this is something you have to learn to work with your artist. If they're both the penciler and the inker, sometimes they might be a very excellent inker and not as great of drawings, like some of the shading or whatever in pencils. So maybe they're like, hey, I get that you don't like this part right now, but wait till I ink it. Now, this is where back to rule number 4, like the setting your budget rules. Understand that if you are working with artists like that there's a clear rule. Like if they do that, right, they've cleared the pencil that you were uncertain about and they're going to draw the inks and then you're still uncool with the inks, make sure that that's not going to be coming out of your budget because they've moved the project forward, right? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. After the inking, it gets to the colorist, and as long as you work with February, you don't have to worry about it. Big shout out to February. Hopefully we don't give him so many projects that he can't handle them anymore. But basically, yeah, you just hand it off to this colorist, and he makes magic happen. But if you're not working with February, if you don't have the luxury to do so, definitely it's something that when you have the colors done, make sure you make the story make sense. We've had it a couple times where even working with February, because he's awesome, he might draw a scene that we in our head know is nighttime, but we didn't write it in the script. And now we're seeing it colored, and we're like, why is it daytime? This is supposed to be scary, right? Because the colorist might not know your whole story either, especially, again, if you're working with artists from around the world. Some of them might not speak English, and if they're just a colorist, right, they don't really need to know your whole story. Now, it's always better if they do, but they don't need to, right? And so because of that, you want to make sure that they're very defined. And that's also back to what we talked about before, editing your script. If you're editing your script for a remastered thing, think about those issues you had the first time, right? One of our panels, we had it where a character's running down a street and he's running the wrong direction, right? Now, the reason why that makes sense in our world is because we're really, we built it out very specifically. But if your world's not as built out, then that's fine. Maybe it's perfectly fine. So you want to make sure that you're looking at what are your rules for your own world and making sure that you're following them along this journey. And then after the colorist, like Greg was talking about, you hand it off to the letterer. And with the lettering, you're going to then finally see where all the bubbles fit, right? Because that's something that, if you're working with a good artist, they should be leaving room for bubbles, right? Very often, if you wrote a story and wrote a panel and you're like, okay, I want the panel to look like this, and they draw it out and they're like, it kind of needs this room. Sometimes you do have to kind of trust your artist because maybe they can see where the bubbles go. Now, if your artist isn't good with that, then maybe you have to be looking for that. Maybe that's one of your checklist items. Okay, I kind of have a lot of words in this panel and there's no room for a bubble, right? So you got to make sure you're looking out for that stuff. And if you're working with Jerome, you also probably don't have to deal with that. He's gonna just, he's gonna fix all your woes. But something you might notice is that even if they follow all your rules, right? So even if you have Jerome working on your team and he writes everything that you wanted, you might now suddenly realize, now that it's drawn out, you can physically see the comic, and you're like, okay, I now see how the story looks in picture form. That doesn't quite fit right now. That's too much. That's too little. It's bad timing. Whatever it is, the writing might not, the verbalization of the comics, the speaking parts of the comics, the mnemonics, the background sounds of the comics might not make sense in this particular scene.
Yeah. Yeah. For scales, actually, there's a lot of writing for this one page when they're on the beach, and we actually cut a bunch of the dialogue out because one, word bubbles didn't fit, and that wasn't Adam's fault. That was my fault because there was just too much writing, too much words, and so much stuff happening. So yeah, we actually cut some of that out because your story matters, but so does your art.
Well, that's something that, as Greg mentioned earlier, our first comic was drawn in very storyboard fashion. Storyboard is meant for film, though, right? Storyboard, you can draw one panel in a storyboard, and people will know, oh, there's 6 things happening in this. But in a comic, you need to separate those, right? Because in a movie, you can draw things by shifting of the camera a little bit, but the camera doesn't shift in a panel, right? You can't change the color of a single panel, where you can just change the color of a film scene, right? So because of these different things that you can do in film, you have different tools in order to pull off these robust things. So for example, if you're drawing a scene where someone's crying in a film, the actual physical tears coming down, you can see the action of that, right? You could be zooming in on them so that you get more and more details. Where in a comic, now here's the interesting thing. With comics, you can actually do 2 different things. Maybe you have to draw 6 different panels of an action scene. But let's say for crying, maybe it's just one big splash page where there's so much detail, you can see the reflection of the one they lost in the pupils of their eyes, right? That's something that you might not do in film, right? Even if it's animation, right? But the whole idea is that that's something you can get really, really detailed with in a single panel. And that can do way more than a 5-minute scene of somebody crying. Where in a film, like, they need you to see this, because the reader, don't forget, the reader isn't flying through your book so fast they can't see the images, right? And they're not flipping through it like it's a film, and they're trying to make the camera roll so fast they can see it. Some of the times they're just staring at that artwork, right? Sometimes there doesn't even need to be words. And the whole point is you want to make sure that while they're looking at that, you've encapsulated the entire story. And so if it's a fight scene, right, you can't draw a fight scene in 2 panels. It's not going to look interesting. Where in a action movie, you could have a fight scene in 3 seconds and have it be epic. You can't do that in panels in comics. You might need 7 panels. You might need a whole page of panels just to show this one fight scene. And so that's what you want to make sure, that now that it's all drawn out and you're seeing the words in it, that you're actually getting the story you wanted to tell. And some of those things are caught ahead of time in the pencils, but some of those are all the way down to the lettering, where you're like, man, this scene's really powerful, and he says way too much, and this is a beautiful splash page. Maybe he just says no. Maybe he just says, oh my God, right? Like, he just says one thing. And sometimes, and we haven't had this yet, but I would believe, there are going to be times you're looking at your artwork and you're like, wow, there shouldn't be anything on this page. Get rid of all the words. This is just so beautiful. You're like, that's exactly what I want, right? And so definitely make sure that you have, like we said, rule number 5 is the clear project management plan, which means you know what you're doing each step of the way. So along with those rules and the budget that you have, you're making sure that you're like, step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3 is this. So when the comic is complete, you're happy with it and you're not regretting that you forgot something six steps ago. And you want to do that along the way. You want, make sure you don't have the entire comic book penciled out. So this is something, for the nerds out there, there's something called the Toyota way. It's actually an engineering thing, but essentially Toyota was the first, I think, car manufacturer that did this. They built a car from beginning to end as quickly as possible, as opposed to going, frame, tires, right? So instead of pumping out individual things such as pencils, then inks, you don't want to do that. You want to get at least a couple pages completely done before the whole comic's penciled. And the reason why is because you need to see how it's going to look at the end. Because let's say you get the entire thing penciled and you're cool with it, and then you get the entire thing inked, and there's like maybe a couple things you're unsure about, but it's good enough. And then you get the entire thing colored and you're like, oh crap, right? This one character looks terrible throughout the whole thing and I couldn't see it till it was colored. Like, you don't want that. So the whole idea is you want to, as you're going through the comic, we have our stuff penciled, maybe 5 pages at a time. Then we have it inked 5 pages at a time, then colored 5 pages at a time. And maybe while that coloring's happening, the next 5 pages are getting penciled. And that's fine. So we're not holding up traffic.
Yeah, it's like an assembly line.
Yeah, but the whole idea is that the beginning of that assembly line is finishing before you're done with the comic, because you want to make sure that first page, that second page, is what you were looking for. Because if not, you got to stop it. And that's the part that Toyota way I was talking about before. What happens is they finish a car quick enough that they're like, oh no, there was a problem with that car. We have to stop the whole assembly line right now. Let's look at this car. What's the problem with it? Cool. Let's go back to the point at which we have to fix it now, and then we'll turn everything back on. So you catch problems faster and you're not pumping out 20 pages of crap. You only pumped out 3, right? So, you want to make sure that you don't pump out an entire bad comic because you don't have a plan. You want to make sure that before the final page is completely penciled, at least your first page is colored. Lettering is a little different. Lettering, I believe, you could probably wait for, just because the lettering can be manipulated with a little more ease. But I would probably even prefer to have the first and second page lettered before your last page is even penciled. And that will just allow you to see, like, oh, that's what it's going to look like. I don't like it. Or, oh, that's what it's going to look like. I'm okay with that. Or that's what it's going to look like, and I love it. Keep going. Right? And if you're okay with it, take a note, because maybe 3 pages later, you're going to go, okay, I need that first page fixed, which I know is going to take a little tweaking now, but it's better than having 16 pages fixed in the future.
Yes.
Nice.
All of that.
And if you stuck with us this far.
But we're going to go over one more rule, but before you do that, please like, share, subscribe. Yeah, see.
Hit the bell notification. Do that, ring it, like just ding.
Ding ding.
I don't know why it doesn't ding. Like, I love gamification. Like, they should make it when you click it, like, ring.
Yeah, I know. Like on people's videos that it can do that, but they just put a little sound effect in.
Oh, I don't mean in the video. I want it when they hit our actual bell below the video. Yeah. Like, so it actually hit subscribe. Not like if we put a bell on the screen, don't click that. That'll do nothing. It'll just pause the video. It's ridiculous.
Now that you clicked like, share, subscribe, and you even commented something.
Now that I have you.
Rule 6. The pros and cons of even remastering your comic. So
wait, now before we dive into this, pause the video, and below, if you've ever remastered your comic or ever considered remastering your comic, what do you think the pros and cons are? If you have remastered it, what were the pros? What did you see as the cons? And if you haven't, I want you to, tell us, like, what do you think are the pros and the cons? And then when you're done with that, press play on the video and you can hear our thoughts.
Yeah, but we'll watch as you comment. If you're listening to this on a podcast,
yeah, if you're driving, don't do that.
Like, don't do that.
Just keep driving.
But
do it later. It's okay. It's not worth it.
But if you're listening on the podcast, there is a Q&A section, and we will put that in the Q&A section. If you're on Spotify, you can actually do that.
Oh, the poll stuff or whatever they added?
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
All right. Rule 6. So the pros and cons is, it's not more of like a rule. It's more of just pros and cons. And
basically consideration of whether or not you should remaster your comic.
Yeah. To sum it all up. So if you don't remaster your comic, you save money, and
a lot of money.
Yeah. And you can move forward, which that's another pro. You move forward and you can grow from that, because actually Catalyst Comics Studio, they said they aren't remastering any of their comics they have already done. They're just moving forward, which that's cool. You don't have to remaster your comic. We're doing it just because I wrote the thing, didn't like the thing, and I was like, well, time to put more money into this.
I would say when it comes to moving forward, like the pros and cons of it, if you have a story that's going to be very, very long, right? You want to make sure that story is pretty good beginning to end. Even, it doesn't need to be perfect beginning to end, although that's the ideal. Everyone wants that. You still want to make sure that it's a congruent story and everyone knows what's happening from beginning to end. So if you have like a 40 issue comic series, right, which is a lot, I will say that's a lot. I probably would not recommend that. I think the standard is like 6, and you can go a little more, a little less. But if you got let's say a 6-part series and your first issue sucks, right? And somebody comes and finds you later and they pick up the first issue, they might not continue reading. So yes, you can move forward, especially if you have a bunch of other ideas, right? If you've got like 16 different series that you have, that's great. But if you've got like a mainstead, your flagship series, that's a little different. You might want to, that would be the pro and con there, is like, if you've got other ones, move forward, right? You got to save time, you got to save money. Yeah, if you're going to be working on this comic for a long time, it's going to be a 6-part, 12-part issue, right, series. You're going to want to make sure that you can clean this up.
Yeah. Our Comic Inc. issue 1, I wasn't even planning on ever remastering that. It's just really short, and I didn't even realize. I've read it multiple times, but it's like super short, and there's only one thing that has to change, but that's going to change when we actually do a Kickstarter for it at some point. I'm not going to tell when.
Well, and even that, so just so everyone can understand, like something for that it's so simple. It's like a single word that we realized later we wanted to change. So we're not even going to remaster the whole comic. We're changing one word on one panel on one page, and after that is changed, it's just a printing thing. So we're not going to, we're not like, basically if you've got the old version, you're going to have like this exclusive limited print of this particular comic, and it's simply because of world building that we changed.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, pros, you get to retell your story the way you wanted to. Cons, it's going to cost you more money. And let's say you worked with the same artist for 3 issues and you just want to redo the first one and you can't get the same artist, right? Then you might, that might be a con. You might have different visuals, right? But that's also, again, back to the pros. Like, let's say you had an artist for your first issue and you didn't like them, so you worked with another artist for the remaining issues. Now you have one comic that doesn't fit the rest of the pattern, so it could be a con to leave it. So it might be actually might behoove you to go back to that first one and have your new artist draw it, or even just an artist that matches the similar look to this new artist, because you don't want to have it where you have one artist whose their work looks so different, it's not even close to the rest of your story. So someone picks up the second issue and they're like, am I reading the same comic? Right? You want to make sure that they're still enthralled in the story.
Well, that was the 5/6 rules of remastering your comic.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in, watching.
Hey, what's this last part? The in conclusion. I like that one. You can read that, Greg. Just read it. Sounds good.
Conclusion?
Yeah, just read the conclusion.
At the end of all of this, it's your mind and your decision to make it or not. I hope this did help you. And if you do decide to remaster your comic, you could just save this for later or just not do it at all.
Yeah. Save this video in your comic book creation. Like, honestly, rule number 5, the project management, I would highly recommend that whether you follow our project management path or, you create one for yourself, definitely very valuable for standard comic creation, or if you're going to be remastering your work. So, definitely, save this video, put it in a playlist, share it with your friends that are trying to remaster their comic, or share with your friends, honestly, even if they skip to this rule, like rule number 6, and just to see like, hey, what's it going to be? Because, they got to weigh the difference of, remastering their comic now or, suffering with the consequences later.
Okay. Well, thanks for tuning in to SeerNova Podcast. This is episode 90. If you are listening on the podcast end of things, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast if you are on Apple Podcast. If you're on Spotify, then thanks for just listening. And
if you're on YouTube, you should check out our other videos playing somewhere in one of these directions. Probably there. I don't know.
Yeah, when the end screen comes up.
Yeah, that's where you should do it.